It was an unusually cold March eve. He came to protect them, but one orphan knew his darkest secret. Welcome to Warm Leaves. I am your host, Raven. Tell me where you're listening from. Your voices keep these mysteries alive. Now, let's step inside. Ning, in the village of Crowthorne, when the tranquility of St. Bartholomew's orphanage was shattered. The building, a stately old structure of weathered stone and creaking timbers, had stood for nearly 2 centuries, and though its roof leaked in spring and the windows rattled in the wind, the place held an air of dignity. Inside, the fire had just been banked low for the night, when a scream split the silence, a scream that didn't belong to any child. By the time Matron Ellis reached the 3rd floor, her lantern beam fell upon a sight that defied sense. The door to the east dormitory stood locked from the inside. The children, 5 in total, were huddled in their beds, wide-eyed but unharmed. And there, in the narrow space between the wall and the window, lay the body of Mr. Alfred Pike, the orphanage's longtime benefactor. His eyes were fixed in glassy horror, his head at an unnatural angle, and in his hand a small brass key tightly clenched. The room itself was a puzzle. The single window was latched from within. The only door, solid oak, was locked from the inside with the key still in the benefactor's hand. There were no signs of forced entry, no scuff marks on the floorboards, no rope or ladder outside the window. Pike had last been seen only an hour before, enjoying tea with the matron in her office. He had complained of a mild headache, but nothing serious. Now he was dead, and not a soul in the building could explain how he had entered the dormitory or why. By morning, the local constable had done all he could, which was very little. Word of the strange death spread quickly, and before noon, Miss Jane Marple, visiting her niece in the nearby village of Ashfield, was at the orphanage door. The matron, though flustered, seemed almost relieved to see her. Miss Marple's reputation for unraveling impossible knots had reached even here, and though she never sought such notoriety, she also never turned away when something was clearly amiss. "Quite unusual, my dear," Miss Marple murmured as she inspected the scene. Her eyes, sharp beneath her gentle expression, took in every detail: the position of the body, the tightly clenched hand, the peculiar faint smell in the air. Something like burnt sugar, though faint enough most would dismiss it. She questioned the children softly, coaxing out their memories without frightening them. None had seen Mr. Pike enter. They had all been drifting to sleep when the scream woke them. One small boy, Henry, mentioned hearing a faint clicking noise earlier, like a clock ticking in the wrong room, but no one else could corroborate it. The matron seemed genuinely distressed, her voice trembling as she explained that Mr. Pike had been a generous, if somewhat eccentric benefactor for years. He visited the orphanage regularly, often unannounced, and insisted on walking the halls alone late at night. "A harmless old man," she said. "A bit secretive, perhaps, but never unkind." Miss Marple noticed the brass key in Pike's hand was unusually ornate, unlike the standard keys used for the dormitory doors. The constable had assumed it belonged to the lock, but Marple suspected otherwise. When she asked to see the matching dormitory key, Matron Ellis hesitated before producing a plain iron one, quite different from the brass key Pike held. That difference, though seemingly minor, pricked at Miss Marple's mind. Why would Mr. Pike enter a room and lock it from the inside with a key that didn't match the lock? And how could he have done so without leaving the children or himself in obvious danger? She asked to see Mr. Pike's belongings, which were still in the matron's office. There was little: a leather briefcase containing ledgers, receipts, and a sealed envelope marked, "To be opened in event of my death." The matron confessed she had not opened it. Miss Marple suggested they wait until the solicitor arrived, but she kept her mind on the curious smell in the dormitory, the locked door, and the brass key. That afternoon, as snow began to fall in soft, steady flakes, Miss Marple took a quiet walk around the orphanage grounds. She examined the stone walls, the placement of the dormitory windows, and the iron drain pipes. There was no way anyone could have climbed up or down unseen in such conditions. Upon returning inside, she lingered near the dormitory again, this time examining the old grandfather clock in the hallway. It had stopped at precisely 9:15 p.m., about the time Pike was last seen alive. When she mentioned this to the matron, the woman paled slightly but offered no explanation. The unusual clue, one ornate brass key, still bothered her. It did not fit the lock, but it clearly meant something. She examined it more closely and noticed faint scratches near the teeth, as though it had been forced into something it did not quite belong to. By evening, a second oddity surfaced. One of the older orphans, a quiet girl named Sarah, shyly approached Miss Marple with something she had found beneath her pillow, a small scrap of burnt paper, smelling faintly of the same burnt sugar scent as the dormitory. The words were barely legible, but one phrase stood out. "Ledger room, do not—" The rest was charred away. Miss Marple's interest deepened. A locked room death, a mysterious key, a burnt note, and an oddly timed clock. These were not random occurrences. They formed a pattern, though not yet a clear one. That night, long after the constable had retired and the children were asleep, Miss Marple sat in the matron's office, piecing together the facts. Mr. Pike had entered the dormitory for a reason. The brass key was important, perhaps belonging to a hidden compartment or another lock entirely. The burnt sugar smell could indicate a chemical, possibly chloroform or a related substance, used to incapacitate or confuse. The stopped clock, too, suggested deliberate staging. As she prepared to retire, she realized something else. The dormitory door's lock had been stiff, as if recently oiled, yet none of the other locks in the orphanage were maintained so carefully. Someone had prepared for this moment in advance. The pieces were beginning to align, though not yet into a complete picture. One thing, however, was certain. Mr. Pike's death was no accident, and whoever orchestrated it had counted on the scene appearing impossible. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. "Ah," she murmured, "but people are rarely as clever as they think." She would sleep lightly that night, knowing that by morning one more small truth would fall into place, and the impossible crime at St. Bartholomew's would begin to unravel. Miss Marple rose early the next morning, the pale light of dawn filtering weakly through the frosted windows of the orphanage. She moved quietly through the corridors, her knitting bag tucked under one arm, though it was not knitting she had come for. The house was hushed. Only the faint crackle of the kitchen fire and the sound of Matron Ellis's footsteps disturbed the stillness. Constable Dawes arrived promptly at 8, his expression one of mild frustration. He had spent the night writing reports, waiting for orders from the county inspector, but the strange circumstances left him feeling uneasy. Still, his questions followed the usual pattern. Was the door locked? Were there any signs of struggle? Had Mr. Pike enemies? Miss Marple listened politely from a chair by the window, her hands folded neatly, but her eyes roamed. She noted how Matron Ellis kept glancing at the desk drawer in which the solicitor's sealed envelope still rested. The woman's hands trembled slightly as she poured tea, though she made every effort to appear composed. "Constable," Miss Marple said in her mild voice, "I wonder, might I see the dormitory once more while you finish your questions?" Dawes agreed with a shrug. He saw no harm in letting the old lady look. Inside the dormitory, the air still held a faint trace of that sweet, burnt smell. She examined the window again, noticing for the first time that a thin layer of frost had formed on the inside of the glass overnight. Yet there was a faint smear near the latch, as though a warm hand had pressed there recently. Moving to the bedside tables, she inspected the few belongings of the children: a cracked toy soldier, a tattered book of fairy tales, a small tin box containing marbles, and one curious item on Henry's table, a single brass button, larger than those on the boys' uniforms, tucked beneath the edge of his pillow. Miss Marple asked the boy about it when he returned from the kitchen. "Found it, ma'am." He said with a shrug. On the floor after Mr. Pike was here last night. Thought maybe it belonged to the matron's coat. But Matron Ellis's coat, Miss Marple knew, had plain black buttons, not ornate brass ones. When she stepped back into the hallway, she found Constable Dawes puzzling over the clock. "Strange business," he muttered. "Clock wound regular every week, yet it stopped dead at 9:15. Miss Marple's eyes softened with interest. She peered closer, seeing the faintest trace of a scratch on the clock face just above the 9, a scratch shaped oddly like a small key's edge might have made. "Perhaps," she murmured to the constable, "it was wound a bit too firmly, or perhaps someone wanted it to stop just so." She said no more, but her mind was turning. The solicitor arrived before noon, a lean, severe man with spectacles perched low on his nose. In the presence of the constable, he broke the seal on the envelope. Inside was a brief note, written in Mr. Pike's own hand. "My affairs are in order. The orphanage is to receive my estate. Certain matters in the ledger must be reconciled. Ellis will know." Miss Marple observed Matron Ellis closely as the note was read. There was a flicker, just a flicker, of something across the matron's face. Not grief exactly, but discomfort. Ellis clasped her hands tightly, her knuckles whitening. After the solicitor departed, Miss Marple asked quietly if she might look through the ledgers. Ellis hesitated, then unlocked a cabinet in her office. The books were meticulously kept, at least on the surface. But as Miss Marple traced the neat columns of figures, she noticed certain entries marked with a faint pencil tick in the margins, as though someone had intended to return and alter them. While she examined the accounts, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the hall. Sarah, the quiet girl who had found the burnt scrap of paper, stood in the doorway, pale and wide-eyed. "Miss," she whispered, "there's someone in the ledger room." "But it's locked." Miss Marple rose at once. The ledger room was a small, seldom-used space at the back of the building, normally kept shut. When they reached it, Constable Dawes was already there, rattling the handle. Locked, just as Sarah said. After a moment, the door opened from within, by none other than the orphanage handyman, Mr. Cray. He claimed he had been checking for drafts, but Miss Marple noticed his shirt sleeve was missing a button, the same size and brass color as the one Henry had found. Cray's eyes darted nervously toward the matron, who avoided his gaze entirely. The constable, still fixated on procedure, warned Cray to stay available for further questions, but did little more. Miss Marple, however, filed the connection away. A brass button, a brass key, both linked perhaps to a hidden lock, one that did not belong to the dormitory door. That evening, as the household settled once again, Miss Marple sat knitting by the fire in the common room, her needles clicking softly. Her mind wandered over each peculiar thing: the frost on the window with its single smear, the stopped clock scratched by a key, the burnt sugar scent, the misplaced brass button, the locked ledger room. She watched Matron Ellis move about the room, fussing over the children, though her eyes seemed far away. Cray lingered by the doorway, watching her in turn, as if awaiting some unspoken signal. And Miss Marple noticed the way Sarah, sitting quietly with her mending, glanced nervously toward the matron's locked desk drawer more than once. Patterns were forming, as they always did when human deceit lay beneath a veneer of normalcy. But the picture was still incomplete. For all her careful observation, Miss Marple could not yet say exactly what had transpired in that locked room. Still, she smiled faintly to herself. People left traces, in the things they touched, in the small lies they told, in the looks they gave when they thought no one was watching. And she, above all, was always watching. By the following morning, she would be ready to tug gently at the loose threads of their stories and see which ones unraveled first. The next morning broke gray and heavy, a damp mist curling around the orphanage grounds. Breakfast was subdued, porridge served in silence, the clink of spoons against bowls the only sound. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively at the corner of the long table, let her gentle conversation coax fragments of truth from those around her. People spoke more freely when they thought no one was paying special attention. After the meal, Constable Dawes announced he would begin formal questioning of everyone who had been in the building the night Mr. Pike died. Miss Marple offered to remain quietly in the background, an offer the constable, somewhat distracted by his own paperwork, readily accepted. Matron Ellis was questioned first. Her account was steady and precise. Mr. Pike had taken tea in her office shortly after 9. He had mentioned a headache, refused her suggestion to rest in the guest room, and said he wished to check the East Dormitory just to see the children. She claimed she had not seen him again until his body was discovered. Miss Marple noted how carefully Ellis avoided mention of the sealed envelope, as though to minimize any impression of foreknowledge. When Dawes asked if Mr. Pike had been troubled by anything recently, Ellis hesitated, only for a heartbeat, before insisting that he was as he always was. Miss Marple's mind lingered on that pause. Next came Mr. Cray, the handyman. He stood stiffly, smelling faintly of tobacco and machine oil. His version matched Ellis's in broad outline. He'd seen Pike arrive, heard nothing unusual, and been in the basement repairing a broken pipe most of the evening. Dawes asked him about the ledger room, and Cray claimed he had entered it the previous day on Ellis's instructions, though he fumbled slightly when pressed about why the door was locked from the inside when he was found there. Miss Marple, still knitting quietly, noticed how his gaze flickered toward Ellis every time a question veered close to specifics. It was the sort of reflexive glance that spoke of divided loyalty or shared guilt. The cook, Mrs. Dawlish, came next, and she was far more eager to speak than necessary. She described in detail how she had prepared supper, how she had served tea for the matron and Mr. Pike, and how she had noticed nothing out of place. Yet her account was almost too thorough. Every moment of her evening laid out with rehearsed precision, as if she had told the story to herself several times before speaking it aloud. When Dawes pressed her about the time, she claimed she had looked at the hall clock just before clearing the tea service, a few minutes after 9. But the hall clock, Miss Marple knew, had stopped at 9:15. How certain could Mrs. Dawlish be of her times if the clock had not been working? The children were questioned next, though only briefly. Henry repeated that he had heard a clicking sound earlier in the evening, like a clock out of step. Sarah, the quiet girl, said she had seen the matron walking toward the ledger room just before lights out, though Ellis herself had claimed she had not left her office. Miss Marple noted how Sarah spoke hesitantly, glancing toward Ellis as if afraid to be overheard. By mid-morning, the questioning had formed a strange tapestry of overlapping truths and subtle contradictions. Ellis claimed Pike went to the dormitory alone. Cray claimed Ellis sent him to the ledger room. Mrs. Dawlish swore to times that did not match the stopped clock. Sarah quietly suggested Ellis had not been where she said she was. Constable Dawes, focused on procedure, saw inconsistencies as unfortunate muddles of memory. Miss Marple saw them for what they were, the seams of a hastily constructed story. After the formal interviews concluded, Miss Marple asked Dawes if she might speak privately with a few individuals. Dawes, believing her interest harmless, agreed. She began with Sarah, sitting with her in the quiet sewing room. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "you're a very observant young lady. I think you've noticed more than you've said. Now, you mentioned seeing Matron Ellis near the ledger room. Was she alone?" Sarah hesitated, twisting the fabric in her lap. "She was with Mr. Cray, miss. They were whispering. I didn't mean to listen, but I heard her say something about the wrong page and him saying it was too late now." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "You've been very helpful, Sarah. You've done nothing wrong." Next, she spoke quietly with Mrs. Dawlish in the kitchen. The cook, still flushed from her interview, seemed eager to convince Miss Marple of her reliability. "Never seen a night like it," she said, wringing her hands. "But I swear I was in the kitchen all the time, except when I brought tea." Miss Marple nodded, her tone mild. "Of course, my dear. And tell me, that tea service, did you bring both cups back?" Mrs. Dawlish blinked. "Why, no. Mr. Pike left his in the office. I expect the matron washed it herself. She doesn't like me fussing about her desk." Miss Marple smiled faintly. She had already noticed the teacup was not among the crockery in the kitchen. It was another small inconsistency. Finally, she found a moment with Mr. Cray in the tool shed. He was oiling a hinge, though his hands trembled slightly. "Funny business, all this," Miss Marple remarked conversationally. "And so much confusion over the ledger room. Tell me, what's kept in there? I imagine it's not just drafts and old furniture." Cray scowled, wiping his hands on a rag. "Just records, old accounts, papers. Not my business to look." Miss Marple's tone softened. "Of course not. But you seem a man who notices things. And I expect you noticed when Mr. Pike visited, how often he lingered near certain rooms." Cray's jaw tightened. "If you're asking if I saw him with the matron in there, I didn't. Not recently, anyway." It was meant to be a dismissal, but the wording was careful. Too careful. By the time Miss Marple returned inside, the mist had thickened, and the orphanage seemed to sit in its own small world, cut off from the village. The contradictions in the testimonies lingered in her mind, circling the way a bird circles a field before landing. Matron Ellis had lied about her movements. Cray was concealing something about the ledger room. Mrs. Dawlish was too eager to be believed, and Sarah, though frightened, had revealed a whisper of the truth, that something in those ledgers mattered enough for people to risk deceit. Miss Marple settled herself once more by the fire, knitting her quiet rose. People always betrayed themselves, she knew, not with grand gestures, but with small slips, the things they thought unimportant. And she had gathered enough of those to begin seeing the shape of what lay beneath. The next step would be to place each contradiction beside the others and see who could still keep their story straight. The mist outside had thickened into a low, colorless shroud by afternoon, swallowing the bare garden and muffling the sound of distant cart wheels on the lane. Inside, the orphanage seemed strangely still, but the silence carried a weight, like a room holding its breath. Miss Marple remained seated in the parlor, her knitting in her lap, though the needles moved more slowly now. Her mind was busy untangling threads that were far more complicated than the wool before her. It was clear enough that each of the principal figures, Matron Ellis, Mr. Cray, and Mrs. Dawlish, had reason to wish Mr. Pike's sudden end. Yet none of their motives seemed entirely sufficient on their own, and none of their alibis explained away all the small anomalies. The burnt sweet smell, the stopped clock, the brass button, the missing teacup. Ellis's motive was the most obvious. The will revealed Pike's estate would go to the orphanage. On paper, a generous act. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that generosity can be tangled with other interests. If the ledgers contained discrepancies, Ellis might fear Pike intended to uncover them, or worse, expose them. Sarah's quiet observation that Ellis had been near the ledger room suggested she had a personal stake in what Pike might discover that night. Cray's place in the puzzle was murkier. He was a man of limited means, but loyal in a watchful, guarded way. His presence in the locked ledger room, his missing button, and his constant glances toward Ellis suggested a complicity that might not be voluntary. Was he protecting her, or himself? Miss Marple had seen many a man drawn into trouble by loyalty to a woman who did not deserve it. Mrs. Dawlish, though seemingly on the periphery, was far from harmless. Her eagerness to talk, her carefully rehearsed account, and her unconvincing precision about the time all pointed to someone anxious to set herself apart from suspicion. But Miss Marple could not ignore the fact that tea, Pike's last refreshment, passed through her hands. The burnt sugar scent in the dormitory was faint but distinct. It could have been nothing more than scorched pudding or something less innocent dissolved in tea. Miss Marple began quietly comparing the timelines in her mind. Pike had arrived just before 9. He took tea with Ellis in her office, then, according to her, went to the dormitory alone. Cray was supposedly in the basement, Dawlish in the kitchen. The clock stopped at 9:15. The question was not only who had the opportunity, but how each person's movements overlapped in those 15 crucial minutes. And then there was the will. Pike's note in the envelope was brief, but telling. Ellis will know. What exactly would she know? That the estate was to pass to the orphanage. Or something in the ledger, perhaps irregularities Pike intended her to correct, or to face consequences for. Late in the afternoon, Miss Marple invited each of them, in turn, to take tea with her in the parlor. She made no formal accusations. People revealed more when they felt safe. Ellis arrived first, stiff but polite, her hands folded primly in her lap. Miss Marple spoke gently of the orphanage, of the great responsibility it must be to manage not only the children but the finances. Ellis relaxed slightly, speaking of the many repairs the building needed, of the constant shortage of funds. And Mr. Pike was always so generous, Miss Marple prompted. A flicker of something crossed Ellis's face. Generous, yes, but particular. He kept very close account of his gifts. Very close indeed. Her voice sharpened momentarily, then softened. Not that there was any difficulty, merely details. When she left, Cray came next, shoulders hunched, smelling of cold air and oil. Miss Marple spoke of the old building, of how difficult maintenance must be with limited resources. Cray admitted Pike had often withheld funds for repairs until certain conditions were met. He was threatening to stop them altogether, Cray said, his voice low. Said there were things in the books he didn't like. Told Ellis to set them right or there'd be trouble. Miss Marple tilted her head. And that concerned you? Cray hesitated. She's kept this place running, ma'am. Whatever's in those books, it's not for me to judge. I just do as she asks. His loyalty was clear, but so was his unease. Mrs. Dawlish arrived last, brisk and flushed from the kitchen. Miss Marple poured her tea and asked about her long years at the orphanage. Dawlish spoke fondly of the children, of the hardships of keeping them fed on so little. And yet, Miss Marple said mildly, Mr. Pike's visits must have eased the strain a little. Dawlish's lips tightened. When he chose to help. Other times he made things difficult, always asking questions about the bills, about the stores, like he was looking for fault. Miss Marple let her speak, watching her expression. There was a glimmer of resentment there, deep-rooted, though perhaps not murderous. Still, resentment can turn to anger when mixed with fear. By the time evening fell, Miss Marple had assembled the pieces of her motive maze. Ellis had a clear motive to protect herself from exposure. Cray, bound by loyalty or perhaps deeper attachment, had reason to assist her. Dawlish, though less central, had grievances and access to Pike's tea. But there was still no single thread tying everything neatly together. She sat by the fire as the children prepared for bed, the low hum of voices in the hallway blending with the rattle of the old pipes. She thought of the brass button, likely from Cray's coat, found near Henry's bed. She thought of the frost on the window, disturbed by a warm hand. She thought of the stopped clock and the missing teacup. Each clue pointed toward someone, yet none alone could prove guilt. But in her long life, Miss Marple had learned that motives often overlap, that crimes can spring from more than one cause. Fear of exposure, loyalty, resentment, all could conspire together in the same small moment. As the house grew quiet, she knew she was close to the heart of it. The motives were tangled, yes, but the truth lay not in choosing one over another, but in seeing how they intertwined. And she had a strong suspicion that by morning, A little gentle prodding might cause the whole web to come undone. The next morning brought a sharp change in the air, as though the weather itself had decided to clear the mist from the orphanage grounds. Constable Dawes arrived earlier than usual, his boots wet from the lane, his expression buoyant in a way that made Miss Marple's knitting hands slow. She had seen that look before. Policemen pleased with themselves always meant one thing: they believed the case was nearly over. "We've found it, Miss Marple," Dawes announced, barely containing his triumph. "A proper piece of evidence this time. In Cray's workshop." She looked up mildly. "Oh? What sort of evidence, my dear?" "A small vial," he said, producing it from his coat pocket, corked and half-filled with a cloudy residue. "Smells faintly sweet, like burnt sugar. Our chemist will test it, but I'd wager it's poison of some kind. And the handyman's fingerprints all over it. It's as good as done." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the vial a moment too long, the faintest furrow between her brows. "Indeed. And where exactly in the workshop was it found?" "In a drawer under the bench, tucked away. Plain as day once you looked for it." Dawes was already imagining the report. And with Cray's button in the dormitory, well, one thing on its own might mean little. But together— Miss Marple inclined her head, neither agreeing nor contradicting. "And where is Mr. Cray now?" "In custody," Dawes said with satisfaction. "We'll have a confession soon enough." That morning's news spread quickly through the orphanage. Ellis moved about with renewed composure, speaking of how unfortunate the whole affair had been. Mrs. Dawlish shook her head over the deceit of men. Even some of the older children whispered about how they'd never trusted the handyman. Miss Marple, however, found her tea less sweet than usual. It was all too neat. A conveniently discovered vial, fingerprints obligingly present. A man with motive enough to satisfy the simplest reading of events. And yet— She visited the workshop after Dawes left for the station, finding it quiet except for the faint smell of oil. The drawer where the vial had been found was unusually tidy, as though its contents had been disturbed and then hastily replaced. Cray was not a tidy man. His tools and parts lay about in comfortable disorder. Why would he take such care with a vial of poison? Back in the parlor, she turned over what she knew. Cray was loyal, even foolishly so, to Ellis. If he had acted, it would likely have been at her urging, but the vial's discovery put the focus squarely on him. Ellis's name was already drifting out of suspicion in the minds of those eager for resolution. That afternoon, Dawes returned, his confidence even higher. "He's not admitted it yet," he said, "but he's close. He knows the evidence is against him. I expect by tomorrow morning we'll have the statement, and I can write this all up proper." Miss Marple only nodded, her expression unreadable. "I see. That will be most efficient." As the evening fell, she found herself once more by the fire, the rhythmic click of her needle steady as the children drifted to bed. Yet her mind was far from restful. If Cray were guilty, certain things still made no sense. Why had the teacup vanished entirely? Why had Pike's will and note been left untouched? Why had the button, so incriminating, been dropped where it could be easily found? These were not the marks of a careful poisoner. They were the marks of someone framing a man for a crime he did not commit. She thought of Ellis again, the careful matron who managed not only the home but every narrative within it, and Mrs. Dawlish, who had been so quick to distance herself from suspicion. Either could have used Cray's loyalty, his proximity, and his lack of sophistication to turn the case toward him. Yet to push now would be to act too soon. Whoever had arranged this was still watching, waiting for the case to close. The real criminal would not strike openly until they believed themselves entirely safe. Miss Marple looked into the fire, her needles stilling. There was no satisfaction in Dawes's breakthrough, only a growing certainty that the game was not over. The shadow still lingered in the orphanage, patient and confident. And patience, she knew, could be dangerous. The orphanage was quieter after Cray's arrest, but it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the sort of stillness that feels staged, as if everyone inside was holding their breath for fear of disturbing something brittle. Ellis walked the halls with new confidence, her voice clipped but calm. Dawlish's chatter in the kitchen was brighter, almost forced. Even the children, quick to pick up the mood of adults, seemed subdued. Miss Marple, however, had lived long enough to know that quiet after a storm often means more trouble is coming. And trouble, in her experience, often has a long memory. It was a stray comment from Henry that turned her mind to the past. The boy had been mending one of his worn socks by the fire, awkwardly, but with determination, when he said, quite without guile, "Funny, isn't it? Mr. Pike used to fix shoes, not give money. Least that's what Matron said once." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Fix shoes, dear," Henry nodded. "She told Mrs. Dawlish last winter. Said Mr. Pike started out mending boots for the children here. A long time ago before he went away and got rich." That detail sat in her mind like a pebble in a shoe. Pike had been part of the orphanage's life far longer than his recent financial interests suggested. If he had history here, there might be debts or grudges stretching back decades, bonds invisible to those who saw only the surface. After Henry went off to bed, Miss Marple began asking quiet questions of those who had been in the village the longest. One old gardener remembered Pike as a young man working odd jobs at the orphanage. Another recalled whispers that Pike left abruptly after a quarrel with the previous matron, a woman by the name of Grace Dawlish. Miss Marple's mind ticked over the name with interest. Grace Dawlish was no longer alive, but her daughter, Mrs. Dawlish, was very much here. And Mrs. Dawlish had always spoken of Pike with a strange blend of resentment and formality, as though her feelings were more complicated than she admitted. That evening, over tea, Miss Marple mentioned her conversation with the gardener in a seemingly idle tone. Mrs. Dawlish's spoon stopped in mid-stir. "Oh, that," she said after a pause. "Yes, my mother knew Mr. Pike well. He worked here a few years, helped out, nothing more to it." Miss Marple nodded as if it were nothing. "And then he left rather suddenly." Mrs. Dawlish's jaw tightened. "There was a misunderstanding over the accounts. My mother took it to heart, but that was long ago." Miss Marple did not press. Long ago, yes, but she had learned that long ago rarely stays buried, especially where money and pride are involved. In the days that followed, she found more threads. Ellis had not always been matron. She had taken the post after Mrs. Dawlish's mother retired. And Cray. He had been a boy at the orphanage himself, one of those Pike had once helped shoe and clothe. The connection was more than professional. These three had all known Pike for years, in ways they seemed eager to gloss over. And then there was the ledger. Dawes had shown it to Miss Marple briefly before locking it away as evidence. Most of the entries were recent, but near the back she had noticed older pages, the ink faded and the sums oddly familiar. Those same irregularities, petty misallocations, mismatched receipts, mirrored the sort of misunderstanding Mrs. Dawlish had hinted at. Pike's visits in recent months might have been less about charity than about finally settling old accounts. It began to take shape in Miss Marple's mind. The present crime was only the final act in a play that had begun decades ago. Pike's generosity was not without strings. He remembered the old ledger as well as the new one. He remembered who had been present when mistakes were made, who had benefited, who had turned a blind eye. The night before his death, Pike had brought not only a new will, but the old ledger to the orphanage. He had intended to settle something that had been unsettled for a very long time, and someone, faced with the threat of that reckoning, had acted. Miss Marple sat by the fire late into the evening, her knitting resting in her lap. The mist had returned to the windows, curling like the long shadow of the past over the orphanage walls. She could see the pattern now. Ellis, the efficient matron, Dawlish, the resentful daughter of a woman once shamed. Cray, the loyal handyman who owed his position to Ellis and perhaps to quiet debts long unpaid. All tied to Pike, all with something to lose if old scandals came to light. This was no crime born in a moment's passion or greed. It was a crime planted years ago, its roots buried deep, now surfacing at last. And Miss Marple knew that the past, once it begins to stir, has a way of dragging the truth up with it, whether the guilty wish it or not. Miss Marple knew the police were content to leave things in the neat box they'd built around Cray. But she also knew that criminals who rely on neat boxes often grow careless once they believe their danger is past. The trick, she thought, was to rattle that false security just enough to make a hidden truth slip loose. She chose her method carefully. The orphanage had a small sitting room that Ellis kept for visiting patrons. It was neat to the point of sterility. Every cushion plumped, every surface polished. Miss Marple asked Ellis if she might use it to entertain the children with a little game. The matron hesitated. A game? Oh, yes, Miss Marple said, smiling with grandmotherly disarming ease. Something I used to do when I was a girl. We'd pass around little tokens, and each person would tell a story about the token. It's remarkable what memories they can stir. With Ellis's reluctant agreement, Miss Marple gathered not just the children, but Ellis, Mrs. Dawlish, and even Dawes, who happened to stop by. She set a tray on the table with an odd assortment. A tarnished button, an old shoe buckle, a chipped teacup, a piece of twine, and a small notebook. Everyone must pick one, she said cheerfully, and say the first memory it brings to mind. No preparation, no overthinking. It keeps the mind sharp, you know. The children took to it easily. Henry picked the twine and told a rambling story about tying up parcels. Another girl chose the shoe buckle and recalled her old boots. Dawes, humoring her, chose the chipped cup and muttered about station canteens. Ellis's turn came. She reached for the notebook, her expression guarded. "It reminds me," she said, voice smooth, "of keeping accounts. We've always been so careful here with every penny." Miss Marple's eyes rested on her for a moment before turning away. Too careful, perhaps. Then Mrs. Dawlish's hand went to the tarnished button. For a moment, she seemed to freeze. "That's an odd one," she said finally, her voice tighter than before. "Looks like something from an old coat. My mother, she used to sew buttons like this. The children wore them out quickly enough. It was a small thing, the kind of thing most people would overlook, but Miss Marple did not miss the faint tremor in her voice, nor the way her gaze flickered, just for a heartbeat, toward Ellis. Later, when the children had gone and the tray was cleared, Miss Marple found herself alone with Dawes in the hallway. "Funny reaction from Mrs. Dawlish," he remarked idly. Miss Marple only smiled. "People sometimes reveal more in games than in interviews, my dear, especially when the game touches something they'd rather forget." The following day, she took her tactic further. In the kitchen, while Mrs. Dawlish was preparing tea, Miss Marple remarked, almost absent-mindedly, on how hard it must have been for her mother to run the orphanage all those years ago, especially with someone like Pike working under her. Mrs. Dawlish's hand stilled on the teapot. "He was just a man trying to make a living," she said, a little too quickly. "My mother always said, well, she said he was clever with money, sometimes too clever." Too clever. The phrase hung in the air. By mid-afternoon, Ellis called Miss Marple to her office under the pretense of discussing donations. But Miss Marple could see the strain in her expression. "These little conversations you've been having," Ellis began carefully. "They've unsettled the staff. I must ask you to leave these matters to the proper authorities." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Of course, dear, but you must know, truth has a way of surfacing. Sometimes all it takes is a nudge." Ellis's fingers tightened slightly on the desk blotter before she dismissed Miss Marple. That was all the confirmation she needed. The game had done its work. Someone, whether Ellis or Mrs. Dawlish, was feeling the edges of the box begin to crack, and when a guilty mind feels a crack, it either doubles down or slips up entirely. Miss Marple intended to be waiting when the latter happened. It was the smell of smoke that woke Miss Marple earlier than usual. Not the thick, dangerous kind. Just a faint, acrid tang drifting in from the hallway. By the time she was dressed and in the corridor, she found Dawes stamping out a small fire in the orphanage's side office. The source was quickly obvious. The old metal waste bin, scorched papers curling in its base. Ellis stood nearby, dressing gown drawn tightly around her, voice sharp with indignation. "Some fools knocked a candle over," she said. Thank heavens Dawes smelled it before it spread. Dawes frowned as he pulled the charred remains from the bin. "Looks more like these were put to the flame deliberate. And these aren't just scrap, they're account papers." He held up a half-burnt page, the faint outline of numbers still visible. Miss Marple stepped closer, noting the fragments. They were not recent accounts. These were older pages, yellowed at the edges. She could just make out a date from over a decade ago, along with a sum that was crossed out mid-entry. Ellis's voice cut in briskly. "Those papers were worthless. Old duplicates that should have been cleared away ages ago. I told Mrs. Dawlish only yesterday to tidy the storage." Mrs. Dawlish appeared in the doorway at that moment, face pale. "I never touched them," she said quickly. "Too quickly. I don't even know what was in that bin." Dawes looked from one woman to the other, suspicion clouding his satisfaction from the week before. Miss Marple said nothing for the moment. It was not the time to accuse, but she noted the sudden appearance of accidents at just the point the past was threatening to break through the surface. That afternoon, another blow came. The vial found in Cray's workshop, the linchpin of Dawes's case, went missing from the station. Dawes returned in a fury, red-faced. Locked in the evidence cabinet it was. Key in the right place, no sign of forced entry. And now it's gone. Ellis murmured condolences. Mrs. Dawlish muttered about incompetence, and Cray sat in his cell, looking more bewildered than ever. Miss Marple sat in the parlor with her knitting, but her mind was working sharply. 2 incidents in one day, the destruction of old records and the disappearance of the only tangible link to the supposed crime. It was too coordinated to be chance. Someone was pruning the case as carefully as one trims a hedge, cutting away anything that might grow into proof of their guilt. The question was, who had both the access and the nerve to move so openly? Ellis ran the orphanage, controlled its rooms, and certainly had her keys. Mrs. Dawlish had long familiarity with its nooks, and her nervousness lately suggested knowledge she couldn't quite contain. And there was Dawes, honest enough, but perhaps a little too pleased to have the case settled neatly. That evening, as dusk set in, Miss Marple took her tea alone by the window. She was certain now that the stakes had shifted. This was no longer about unmasking a poisoner. It was about outpacing someone who was actively dismantling the trail behind them. And when someone grows desperate enough to burn papers and steal evidence from under a constable's nose, their fear is very near the surface. Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest smile. Fear, she knew, is often the final mistake. The orphanage had settled into an uneasy rhythm again. Cray still locked away, Dawes sulking over the lost vial, Ellis watchful as a hawk. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that calm before the end of a case was rarely true calm. Her unease proved justified on the 3rd night after the fire. It began with a commotion in the east wing, a sound of hurried footsteps, then a sharp cry that echoed down the hall. By the time Miss Marple reached the source, half the household had gathered. Mrs. Dawlish lay slumped on the floor of the storeroom, her right hand still gripping the edge of a cabinet. A tin of ledgers had spilled beside her. Ellis knelt over her, voice crisp but not panicked. "She's fainted. Fetch water." But Dawes, who had come at the same time as Miss Marple, bent to examine the scene. His eyes narrowed at the faint red mark along the older woman's wrist. "That's no fainting fit. Someone grabbed her." Mrs. Dawlish's eyes fluttered open then, but her words were a murmur. I thought I heard something in the old records cupboard. And then someone behind me." She trailed off, shaking. Miss Marple glanced at the open cupboard. Several boxes of files had been dragged out, their contents rifled. It was the same pattern. Someone searching, someone destroying, someone silencing any witness who looked too closely. That night's attempt was different, though. It was bold, reckless. Whoever had tried to attack Mrs. Dawlish was either cornered or desperate, and desperation, Miss Marple knew, made people sloppy. She made a quiet circuit of the orphanage after the household returned to their rooms. In the corridor near the storeroom, she noticed something odd. A faint trail of dusty prints leading away from the cupboard toward the side stairs. Not shoe prints, hand marks, as if someone had braced themselves on the wall, perhaps to steady a burden or move quickly in the dark. The side stairs led directly to the rear yard and to Cray's workshop. By morning, Dawes was in an uproar. "Cray's still in custody, has been for days. Whoever's been causing trouble, it's someone still in this house." Ellis was quick to agree. "All the more reason to keep order," she said, her voice hard. But her eyes flickered, just for a moment, toward Mrs. Dawlish's closed door. Miss Marple remained silent, but her thoughts were moving quickly. A second crime had been attempted, this time on someone who had lived at the heart of the orphanage for decades, and whoever the villain was, they weren't simply protecting themselves anymore. They were eliminating any threat to the truth. The game had shifted. It was no longer about solving a murder that had already taken place. It was about preventing the next one. The orphanage, rattled by the attack on Mrs. Dawlish, seemed quieter than usual. Ellis doubled her vigilance, keeping the children close, locking storerooms and watching visitors with a hawk's eye. Dawes, for his part, stalked through the halls like a restless dog, searching for a trail he couldn't find. Miss Marple, however, chose a different tactic. She sat by the fire in the sitting room, knitting. It was an old trick. People assumed she was idle when she was, in fact, listening. And it was in one of those moments of quiet listening that the smallest thread began to tug loose. Mrs. Dawlish, recovered but still pale, was speaking to Ellis about the ledgers. "Funny thing," she said without much thought. "I swear I saw one of those books years ago with a button pressed between the pages. I thought it must have been one of the children's trinkets, but it's gone now." Ellis gave a curt shrug. "Old rubbish. Things like that don't matter." But Miss Marple's needles stilled for a heartbeat. A button. Her mind drew back to the game she'd played in the sitting room. The tray of odd items, Mrs. Dawlish's reaction to the tarnished button, had been the first true crack in the calm surface of the orphanage. She had claimed it reminded her of her mother's mending, but her eyes had flickered toward Ellis. Now, the same button had reappeared in conversation, hidden in a ledger. A ledger that, if Miss Marple guessed correctly, would have been among those in the storeroom. Miss Marple asked gently, "Would this button happen to be the same type as those on the coats the children wore in your mother's time?" Mrs. Dawlish looked startled, then nodded slowly. "Yes, I suppose it might." "Why?" "Because," Miss Marple said mildly, "I've found that people often tuck away small things as reminders. Or, in some cases, as markers. A pressed flower for a love letter, a ribbon for a promise kept, or broken." She didn't press the matter further in front of Ellis, but the thought stayed with her. The button had been hidden for a reason, and if someone had been searching the ledgers with such determination, it might not have been sentiment they were after. That evening, while the house quieted, Miss Marple asked Dawes for a small favor. "Would you be so kind as to let me see any ledgers you have left from the storeroom? I think perhaps a certain page might prove instructive. Dawes brought what remained. 3 battered volumes, their spines cracked, their pages filled with neat, careful sums. It was in the second book that she found it, a faint circle, no bigger than a coin, pressed into the paper between entries. There was no button now, but the mark it left was clear, and the entry it marked was curious indeed, a payment made to J.P. in a year when the orphanage's funding had been unusually low. Miss Marple sat back. J.P. She had heard those initials before, not in conversation about the present, but about the past. John Pike, the handyman. The man dismissed quietly, without scandal, years ago, and suddenly the shape of it began to form, the ledgers, the destruction of old papers, the obsession with removing certain traces. It was not just about the murder in the workshop. This was about a trail that led years back, through hidden payments, dismissed employees, and perhaps a long-simmering grudge. The key, she realized, had been in plain sight from the beginning, in a tarnished button and an old ledger that someone had been desperate to destroy. And now, she thought, it was time to see just how desperate the culprit would become when the pattern was laid bare. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple decided the time had come to unsettle the still waters. Dawes was in the parlor, trying to piece together a coherent report for his superior. Ellis hovered as always, ensuring no conversation escaped her notice. Mrs. Dawlish, pale but recovering, busied herself with her endless mending. Miss Marple settled in quietly, her knitting in her lap, and began speaking as if to herself. Curious thing, how people hide their worst secrets in plain sight. A tarnished button, for example, or an entry in a ledger no one thinks will ever be read again. Ellis looked up sharply. Buttons and ledgers are hardly the business of murder, Miss Marple. On the contrary, Miss Marple replied mildly, they can tell us quite a lot about why someone would go to such lengths to destroy the past, particularly when those ledgers show irregular payments to someone like John Pike, who, if I recall, left the orphanage under unfortunate circumstances. Mrs. Dawlish's hands stilled over her mending. Ellis's face tightened. Miss Marple's voice remained soft, but her eyes were sharp. One wonders what sort of arrangement would make a matron risk her reputation to keep it hidden for decades. Unless, of course, the payments were not truly to Pike at all, but to someone using his name to disguise another purpose. Dawes looked confused. Another purpose? What are you implying? Miss Marple turned her gaze toward Ellis. That those payments were tied to a child, one who was never entered in the official rolls, a child connected not to charity, but to shame. That sort of thing is a dreadful burden to carry, Miss Ellis, or should I say, Mrs. Pike. The room went still. Ellis's voice, when it came, was brittle. You're spinning nonsense, old woman. But Miss Marple did not relent. I think not. I think your connection to John Pike was more than professional. A child, born in secret, passed off as another foundling, and then vanished from the records. That would explain your desperation to keep the ledgers intact for so long, and then to destroy them when someone began to look too closely. Mrs. Dawlish gave a choked sound. I told you she'd find it out, she muttered, her voice trembling. Ellis rounded on her, eyes flashing with fury. You old fool! But Miss Marple's voice cut cleanly through. The murder, Miss Ellis, was never about Mr. Cray. It was about keeping a past secret buried, and when that secret began to surface, through old papers, through whispers, you acted. First by removing the threat in the workshop, then by silencing anyone who might remember too much. Mrs. Dawlish came next because she knew where the records were. But the true root of all this was not money, or even reputation. It was fear. Fear of the scandal, fear of exposure, and perhaps most of all, fear of losing control over the life you built on that deception. Ellis stood frozen for a long moment. Her composure, always so perfect, cracked just enough to show the truth beneath. There was no confession. Alice was far too proud for that. But the set of her jaw, the hardening of her eyes, told Miss Marple she had struck true. Dawes looked between them, still trying to fit the pieces together, but Miss Marple had no need to press further. The motive was no longer hidden. It had been there all along, woven into the fabric of the orphanage's history, quiet, patient, and deadly when threatened. And now, she thought, the time was drawing very near when the whole tapestry would unravel. The following evening, Miss Marple requested something unusual, a quiet gathering in the orphanage's dining room. Only the essential people, Dawes, Mrs. Dawlish, Ellis, were asked to attend. The children had been ushered off to bed early. The long table stood polished and empty, save for a single battered ledger and a small object lying neatly beside it, a tarnished button. Ellis entered last, her posture as crisp as ever. "This is irregular," she said sharply. "We should be resting, not playing parlor games." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. But I've found parlor games have a way of revealing truths people would rather keep hidden." She gestured toward the ledger. "This book, you see, survived the fire in the storeroom. By chance, or perhaps because someone thought it of little importance. But on page 74, she opened it, tapping a spot marked faintly by a circular impression, we find a payment to JPA, small amount, repeated at irregular intervals, over years." Dawes leaned in, frowning. "We've been over this. John Pike." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, Inspector. Mr. Pike was long gone by the time these payments continued. And yet they were always marked with the same symbol. A small, pressed circle, the exact size of this button." She held it up, letting the faint light glint off its worn surface. Ellis's expression did not change, but her shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "such a mark is not simply a quirk. It is a private code, a signal to the one who receives the money, a code known only to the person who left it and the one who expected it. A mother and her hidden child, perhaps, or a woman ensuring her past remained her own." Mrs. Dawlish shifted uneasily. "Miss Marple," she began, but the older woman silenced her with a soft glance. "Fear, Miss Ellis," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but unyielding. "That is what has guided you all these years, not greed, not cruelty for its own sake. Fear. And when Mr. Cray stumbled too near the truth, you could not risk it. When Mrs. Dawlish lingered too long in the ledgers, you could not risk her either. And yet—" She leaned slightly forward, her gaze calm. "Fear makes mistakes. It leaves traces. It makes patterns, and it has brought us to this moment." The room was heavy with silence. Dawes looked between them, every muscle tensed. Ellis stood still, her hands clasped before her. Then very softly she said, "And if I were to deny it all?" Miss Marple's smile didn't falter. "You might. But the constable outside has already taken a statement from Mrs. Dawlish and from the boy in the yard who saw you coming from the workshop that night. Combined with the ledger and the missing files you claimed never existed." She folded her knitting neatly in her lap. "You may deny it, Miss Ellis, but the truth is already out." For a long moment, Ellis said nothing. Her jaw tightened, her eyes fixed on the button on the table. Then, in a movement so sudden Dawes half rose, she swept her hand across the table, sending the button spinning, the ledger slamming shut. But she didn't reach for a weapon or the door. She stood very still, her voice cool and controlled again. "It seems, Miss Marple, that you've done what you came to do. Congratulations." Dawes stepped forward, producing the cuffs. Ellis did not resist as he placed them on her wrists. Her eyes, still sharp, met Miss Marple's. "I hope you're satisfied." Miss Marple gave her a small, almost sorrowful smile. "I'm never satisfied when fear drives someone to such lengths, but I am relieved the truth is safe at last." As Dawes led Ellis from the room, the tension drained like air from a long-held breath. Mrs. Dawlish slumped in her chair. Miss Marple, her work complete, began gathering her knitting again. Outside, the night was still. Inside, the orphanage felt lighter, as if some long shadow had finally lifted. The orphanage had settled into a fragile calm. Ellis was gone, escorted under guard, and Dawes seemed content that the case was neatly tied with string. Mrs. Dawlish tried to resume her routines, though her hands trembled when she handled the ledgers that remained. The children, sensing the shift, grew quieter but freer, as if some unspoken tension had loosened. Miss Marple, however, did not leave. She lingered in the small guest room, knitting in the lamplight, her eyes distant. To anyone else, the case was finished. But there was a problem, one she could not quite put aside. It was the matter of the button. When she had set it on the table during the confrontation, Ellis had looked at it as if it were a weapon. And yet, Miss Marple had never said it had come from the ledgers themselves. She had found it, in fact, in the yard near the workshop door, a place Ellis could not have been at the exact time she was supposedly in the office destroying papers. That inconsistency gnawed at her. Ellis had motive, yes, and fear aplenty, but motive and opportunity are not the same thing. The answer came, as it so often did, in the form of something small, Mrs. Dawlish humming as she mended a child's coat. The tune was an old nursery rhyme, but she stumbled at a line just as she had stumbled in conversation before. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. That night, when the house slept, she moved quietly to the office. She took down the remaining ledgers, setting them in order. Between two of them she found it, a scrap of cloth, fine and worn, with the same tarnished button still attached. Not one button, then, but two. And this one, unlike the first, had been deliberately stitched into the lining of the ledger cover itself. The ledger bore a series of payments, small, careful, to household repairs, yet signed not by Ellis, but by Mrs. Dawlish herself. Payments made in the same years that the larger J.P. transfers occurred. In the morning, Miss Marple requested Dawes return once more. He arrived, looking bewildered, but when she laid the cloth and ledger before him, his confusion turned to sharp attention. It was Ellis's fear that made her easy to suspect. Miss Marple explained softly. But the true hand guiding this was Mrs. Dawlish. She used Ellis's history as a shield, knowing suspicion would fall there. The payments, the missing files. Ellis believed she was covering her own past. In truth, she was covering Mrs. Dawlish's. Mrs. Dawlish sat very still, her mending in her lap. "And what is it you think I've done, Miss Marple?" she asked at last, her voice calm, almost tired. "You kept someone safe," Miss Marple said gently. "But to do so, you bled the orphanage's funds for years. When Mr. Cray discovered discrepancies, he became a danger. And when Ellis began digging in the ledgers for her own reasons, she too became dangerous. If she looked too closely, she might realize whose name truly appeared on those entries. You used her fear, and when the moment came, you let her take the fall." Mrs. Dawlish gave a faint, rueful smile. "You make it sound so cold. I only wanted to protect." She stopped herself, but her eyes flickered toward the stairs, where the children slept. Miss Marple's voice was steady. "We often harm most those we believe we are protecting. The truth is safer now than any secret could be." Dawes, shaken, moved to take Mrs. Dawlish into custody. She did not resist, but her expression held none of Ellis's bitterness, only a quiet resignation, as if she had known this moment was always waiting. When she was gone, Dawes turned to Miss Marple. "You could have left it. No one would have known." Miss Marple looked out the window toward the orphanage yard, her knitting bag at her side. "Ah, but I would have known, Inspector, and so would the children. Secrets fester. Better they sleep in a house with the truth in it." The case, at last, was truly over, or as close to over as such things ever are. Inspector Dawes returned to the orphanage 2 days later, his boots crunching on the frosted path. Inside, the air was clearer somehow, though the corridors still echoed faintly with whispers. Ellis had been formally charged, but now there was the far quieter matter of Mrs. Dawlish. Ellis's case was solid, yet it was not the end Dawes had thought he'd have. When Miss Marple insisted on one last conversation in the dining room, Dawes suspected her usual habit, an unraveling of threads until the tapestry lay bare. The children were again tucked away, the room still and empty save for the long table. Miss Marple sat at the head, her knitting idle in her lap. Dawes sat opposite, notebook ready. "You see, Inspector," she began, "there are two kinds of justice. What the courts call justice, and what the truth demands. Ellis's guilt is not a simple matter. She burned documents, yes, and her fear nearly led her to more dangerous choices. But the central crime, the theft, the death of Mr. Cray, those were not hers to bear alone. Mrs. Dawlish had more to lose and more to hide." Dawes tapped his pencil against the page. She signed the entries in the ledger. "We have your cloth and the second button. That's all solid enough." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, but you must see the elegance of it. Ellis's fear was her greatest weakness, and Mrs. Dawlish knew precisely how to shape it. The missing files?" Ellis removed them, believing she was safeguarding her past. But Mrs. Dawlish told her exactly which files to take, never realizing she was removing the wrong ones from danger and leaving the incriminating ledgers untouched until she could destroy them herself. Mr. Cray, however, saw the gap and began to ask questions. That was when Mrs. Dawlish acted. Dawes frowned. "You're saying Dawlish killed him outright?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Oh, no. He was an ill man, Inspector, and she knew it. A sudden quarrel, the shock of discovery, a moment of overexertion, and she was there to watch the result. Not a hand raised, but no help given either. Some would call it nature taking its course. I call it calculated inaction." Dawes scribbled slowly. "And the button?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Two buttons, in truth. One outside the workshop. Ellis's dropped as she rushed away after her attempt to burn the records. That was the clue that made her seem obvious. But the other button, stitched into the ledger cover, was from an old coat Mrs. Dawlish wore in the years of the questionable payments. She thought nothing of replacing it with another, but she did not think to remove what remained in the ledger when she hid her dealings. A small thing, but one cannot...